Hello everyone, welcome, and thank you so much for coming on time. That is a great start. Welcome to our event with Artefacto about documentary in the age of AI. Just really 5-minute intro, a bit of context about where we are. We're at the Netherlands Film Academy, and me and Pablo are part of a project, as well as Mieke, who welcomed you potentially at the elevator and told you had arrived at the right place, and Stan, who's in the audience. Hello. We're part of a project called AI Greenhouse. It's a 2-year artistic research project where we're exploring sort of both the creative and ethical questions around AI, specifically in filmmaking and film education. So rather than thinking about AI as like faster, stronger, better, we're not very interested in that narrative. Rather, we're like, questioning these ideas of like authorship and sustainability and creative control. So we're like both really interested in what it can offer creatively, but not without sort of losing the critical questions, and then figuring out how to incorporate that in our own creative practices as well as film education. And as part of that, we're doing this event series, and this is the first one that we're doing with Artefacto. We'll tell you a bit more about that. Anyway, so just very quickly, the timing. So we'll start now, and we'll have an hour of the hour-ish of their artist talk. Then we'll have like 30 minutes or so for any questions that you want to ask. So I do very much invite you to ask deep, niche, nerdy questions. It's very much what we're here for. When me and Pablo were like thinking about what to do for these events, we were like, oh, do we do sort of AI and film introduction stuff? And we were like, no, let's get really nerdy and specific. So I invite you to sort of go on this like research journey with us and ask any questions you have in those 30 minutes. And Pablo, do you want to share a bit more about why we invited Artefacto for this first one?
Yeah, more than an introduction to Artefacto, that I think they will speak about their work more extensively. I just want to say why we decided to start this series with Artefacto. They have been working for quite a while with artificial intelligence in film, from the year 2016, making documentaries about artificial intelligence and also working with artificial intelligence. And also because their background comes from filmmaking. Unlike other artists who maybe come from computer science or design, the background of Artefacto has been filmmaking. They've seen how this technology has evolved in the past years. They have made collaborations with companies that are now very well known, for example, Hugging Face or Runway ML. And also they have a trajectory that has been validated by different important film festivals, South and Southwest, IDFA, and Hot Dogs.
Funny you should mention IDFA.
And I was going to mention IDFA because they happen to have a film, a short film that is being presented during this the festival. There's several screenings. I think they're somewhere here. So tomorrow there's one. It's a short documentary that is presented before feature documentaries. They very smartly called it 0905-1982 for people who want to have their films in film festivals. This is a good tip because it starts before the letter A, so you will always be on top of the list.
They think in metadata.
Exactly, thinking in metadata. So yes, without further ado, I just let you with Artefacto.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, hello, it's a privilege to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting us because we really admire your work and we love to to be here. So thanks a lot for coming. Today what we are going to do is to talk about our work, about how we use AI in our film practice, with some examples and some framework in the framework, and to understand how we see this technology and how we use it. So we call it cinema thinking through machines. I'm Ana Giralt and Jorge Caballero. To talk a little bit about what we do in Artefacto and how we think about all this. We come from cinema. We are filmmakers and producers, and but we have always been linked to technology, and we've been researching that since interactive documentaries, VR. So for us, going into understanding how AI was shaping filmmaking, it was supernatural back in 2016. And then we started to conceive, okay, what happened if we think movies through technology, and we try to understand what are the possibilities of these models and how we can apply this technology to the films. So it's more a research-based production company where we allow us to get influenced and shaped by the technology in the way we create films. So this is one of the things that we will explain today. And we also like to share the knowledge. So.
Well, yes, thank you very much for being here, and thank you, Nadia and Pablo, for this super nice invitation. And well, actually, we also work in academia in several universities in Barcelona, Latin America, so we have this kind of link between, academia, research, and film production in general. So we like to be placed in something like that, something in the middle. That is not very common, because most of the time you're working with film studies or perhaps with artificial intelligence, but not something in the middle. And we have found that there's like a lot of possibilities to work between both sides and link different kind of methodologies and possibilities from both sides. So we like to work in this kind of framework.
Yeah, with just some examples of some of the last papers that it's been published in more academical fields. If you are interested, it was more trying to understand how people is using AI in film and what kind of films people are producing. It's more about short films. And yeah, also this is kind of our presentation card. We've been in many major film festivals, as they have said. And it's interesting because we found also that in those big festivals like the Toronto, Rotterdam, IDFA, it's where we find the most interesting places to discuss about the films done with AI. Because in the industry, sometimes it's more difficult to have engaging and interesting conversation on okay, if you were using this technology, how and why. So that's a nice place to talk.
And something that has been happening like a little by little, because for the first time we start with technology using interactive documentary and virtual reality and so on, and was like a pretty fast. But with artificial intelligence in several film festivals and so on, we are watching that it's like keeping it slow, that they are trying to understand this by step by step. It's not like a like a faster process that we have lived previously.
So we
where
wanted
are we?
Yeah. So that was us. That's the real world. And so now we are in a moment where we are like apocalypticos e integrados, apocalyptics and integrates. I don't know if it's a good translation, like the extremes, right? Like you are super like fan of AI or you are super against. So it's difficult to be in the middle, like, okay, like we are in this space. I think like, okay, we understand it's a technology, it's a problematic technology in many ways, but also it has a really interesting things. So in this sense, Guillermo del Toro is on the extreme. And this is what we face most of every day in when we are dealing with this kind of films in the more industrial landscape, meaning with film fans, for example, how film fans are understanding this, how the Film Academy is understanding the use of AI. So it's more in this side. Now it's opening, but
yeah, that is completely normal, and we are super agree with this kind of criticism. This is the other thing that we want to mention in this talk, that we are not like a evangelist of artificial intelligence in a way, that we are super critics in the using of this technology as well. But we have found that we could, use this kind of technology for several methodologies that we will explain later. But we understand that kind of, rejection of this technology and why they are worried. But there's a gap, and there's a possibility to understand and to use this technology in several ways.
And just one thing that we always like to know is to try to understand if that things happened before. And of course, we've been here before. And when the invention of photography led to this disruption of the actual conception of art, and how Baudelaire was really against photography, and he was just saying that it was for lazy people that really didn't got the skills to really recreate reality. So we like to put Baudelaire beside Guillermo del Toro, because it's really the same paradigm again. So for us, it's really interesting to read more about that moment, to have more tools to understand what's happening now, because it really happened before, right? With now the scale is huge, so it was not the scale, it was not the same, and the implications. But just another examples, for example, when home computers were in the market, or elevator sickness. Yeah. So anyway, there is this site that is called the Pessimist Archive. If you want to check it,
we really
you can
recommend
find
this.
all this.
Is the Pessimist Archive, and you could find here like a lot of, we love this website. It's really nice. If you want to check the history of the things that, how technology was trigger so many things, and how press in that time avoid several things. So it's really nice, to keep in mind that this is not the first time that has happened.
So we will talk not only, but mostly about documentary in the age of AI, because we come from documentary filmmaking. It's true that now we are starting to do some fiction, thanks to AI. But what we study more and we try to understand the impact, it's more in documentary. And there are two important things for us when we create images with AI, that now it's really easy to all these images to pass like real images, right? What is in stake when we create images and we put this kind of images in in a documentary, right? So first, credibility, right? Because that credibility, it's no longer rests in a photochemical trace that actually, that you can trace back the process into a real object or into a real fact. So now what is actually on stage and what we need to really be really careful, it's in the process. So we need to be really transparent, and credibility, it's more in this transparency and in understanding what was recorded or what was narrated. And another thing, it's responsibility, that it's really on us. So how we use these algorithms and really can assist and can help us in many things, but our moral criteria and our ethical concerns has to be the same, even more, right? So because sometimes we tend to put responsibility on the models, on outside us, and it's really only on us. So in this paradigm, when we start using AI and in our practice, we try to answer these two questions, right? How can we analyze what already exists, And with those readings of this analysis of what already exists, how can we orient the new making of images? So it's mostly analyze and making. So it's really the two kind of AIs that we use in our work, because mostly generative AI is the most fancy AI, and probably you already know, but we use a lot the discriminative AI, which is most content understandings. And so now we will talk about what does it mean to use this.
And actually, you know, as a filmmakers, we are all the time like dealing with this kind of, we now have this kind of technology that enable us to have like a kind of mechanical eyes to understand the complexity of media, because right now we are living in this kind of abundance of media, of images, videos, audios, and so on. So perhaps these technologies also give us this kind of like possibility to navigate into that kind of complexity. So this is super interesting for us, because, you know, as a filmmakers, we are dealing all the time with, okay, let's organize the materials in a way. Let's try to figure out how we could, you know, like arrange new kind of methodologies for editing, or let's try to do something different in the way how we edit and so on. So that kind of understanding the content that we already produce in, you know, like in the traditional way is something that is really, really useful for the use of artificial intelligence. And that's the first idea that we want to mention here about that term that is usually known as a discriminative AI, but perhaps you already find this kind of analytical artificial intelligence, but you know, most of the time content understanding or this kind of stuff, and we are talking about like extract patterns, you know, like a spot narrative patterns, compare structures, analyze data, and so on, and everything that is related with the data that you already have.
So, and when we use these systems, that now we will go more in concrete, so you will understand through projects. What it happened, it does allows us this archaeology, right? So there are many projects that really now arise and that we create because the technology allows us. It allows us to now, for example, read and understand like 10,000 images, right? So if I can understand 10,000 images in a week, not in like 1 year with many people, I really can create a project out of that. So it really allows us to create an open, and expands how we think through what already exists. And this for us is really, really understanding. Because we come from documentary filmmaking and because we really like to analyze the reality and the present, which sometimes it's difficult. So as to understand, for example, this is one project that we did like some years ago, but we are still updating it. And I was researching the communication, the visual communication patterns of the extreme right in Spain, trying to understand how they communicate through Instagram, right, in their accounts. So we were doing it before with PSV. Now we were trying it with Clip, another technology, but mostly we were scrapping these 6,000 images, and then he's Santiago Pascal, and we were doing this clustering. I mean, the algorithms were clustering. So for me, it was a way to really understand these images and to understand many patterns of communication, and then from that you can do anything. So you can do that with any kind of image or any kind of data that you realize. And then we create these visualizations that for us it's also interesting, because with AI, in the logics of AI, it's always spatial notions, because you put things on a multidimensional layers. So for us, it's also about, okay, how can we visualize all this information? So it's always about, okay, I can really search into a vast amount of data, but then how I can understand those visualizations. So we are always trying to deal also with the interface that it's more understandable for us. So this is another example of, espera, al principio. Vale. There is this theory of distant reading that allows you this idea to go from far, right? Normally when we are working in a script or anything written, normally we just interact with the text like this, right? You interact in a certain way, you always read, from up to down. So what happens if we try to really understand this text in a non-linear way, and we try to apply many of these ideas that are in the academia of quantification and semantic clustering, right? So what happens if I understand my text through the relationships between words instead of reading linearly? What happens if I understand every time that I talk about one character, what are the adjectives or the verbs that are related to the character, for example? Or what happens if I talk to my script and ask, okay, what's the theme of what I'm talking about? And then with a semantic analysis, just meaning okay, you are using these words, we can cluster these words in these families, so you are mostly talking about family, for example. So this project, we started this project to try to analyze our scripts from another perspective. It's a tool that we developed when we are just really tired of writing alone and we need another tool to understand what we are doing. And then it's been nice and successful, and we are doing this collaboration with the Film Academy in Spain, and every year we are analyzing some scripts of a residency that they have for script writers, and every year we are improving the application that we created. And so far it's really interesting for this mainly two reasons. First, because you can engage with the text in a visual way. Also, for example, here understanding, okay, this is my film, and the themes that appear in the film, they are visually represented in these two colors, for example. And people really helps to understand, how they are writing, because you really understand many things that are not visible in the first moment.
And for the script writers, it's like a kind, when you are trying to, when you have the first version of your script, most of the times you are, you work with the script doctor or something like that, and perhaps you need that kind of distance, and with these kind of techniques and these kind of possibilities, you have this kind of distance as well. Because it's not like the paradigm here is not like okay, ChatGPT, help me to improve this sequence, but it's like okay, give me some kind of data related with that sequence to understand better what is the pace, what is the reading, what is the topics about that, and then I decide how is the best option to do it. So it's like a very different kind of different perspective, a different approach. In front of your text, in front of your images.
Yeah, and also, for example, we do this to help us even be more creative, which it can happen or not, or at least to have a kind of another perspective. The commercial tools that you can see out there that are about analyzing the scripts are mostly the purpose is just to create the best script for the next blockbuster, right? In terms of revenue only, because there are many commercial tools, which are okay. It's not about criticizing, it's about the different ways, right, that we can see. One way it's like, okay, how can these tools help me in anything I need for my creative process? And another way it's, okay, how can I speed up process, foresee the future, understand if this will fit in a previous pattern. So, but it's interesting also that you can trick a little bit.
Yeah.
And
also it's like a kind of, like a corrector ortográfico, how do you say that? Like a
orthographic. corrector?
orthographic corrector,
Spelling mistakes.
spelling mistakes, but with asterisks, like something like this, really able to say, okay, look, this character is not in the sequence, but this character has like a kind of dialogue, but why is this character is not in the sequence? That kind of questions that could be, like a really improving for your script writing, but also to improve the understandability beyond the readers and so on. So, in the 4 years that we have developed this tool for the script writers in Spain, we noticed that for them it's like a really nice tool, to have this kind of approach and this kind of new map of, okay, this is my script, this is the sequence, this is all the characters, all the sequences that I have, and I also have this possibility to move and to create like another kind of visualization and a really nice tool to visualize the things that are good and the things that perhaps are not that good.
Yeah, and even sometimes they realize that, okay, I didn't meant to talk about this theme, but it's recurrently appearing, so why? Okay, maybe because I'm using this kind of words, so it's really understanding, because since we only upload the script, it's like the idea is like, okay, what the machine understands, probably a human will understand also without only reading, right? So it's been really nice so far, and we continue developing. And then there are more practical things like the pre-production, extraction of the information. So another thing that we use this idea of distant reading, it's not text, it's image also. When we are in post-production moment, normally when you are editing, I guess many of you are filmmakers, right? Or not? Can you, right? Because I'm really talking to filmmakers. Okay, cool. So when you are in the editing process, and mostly in a documentary, it can get really stuck with a lot of material, a lot of time. Sometimes the movie you really created there. Sometimes, so we are trying to implement those systems, and lately we are doing when we are in this moment. So now, instead of sitting in the room, in the timeline, talking after a screening, you are screening a rough cut or a work in progress, whatever, instead of being there in the same room, we are creating this, and it's super nice is to see the movie from far, and to see it in this grid. It's like the post-its, I guess, many of you use, and you really need sometimes in the process to just go back and see your movie, in a wall or something like it, and it's really helpful to see things that normally you don't see it because you are seeing in a linear way.
Yeah, in a way, we are like, all the time we are thinking in this kind of, the digitalization of materials and so on, they allow us to create like something different. But in editing, for instance, we are still working in the same linear way for so many years, for 100 years, we're still in a timeline, like thinking the movies in that kind of stuff, no? So what happened if we could, trigger another kind of methodology? And, as Anna has mentioned, the rough cuts for us is like, the filmmakers, we as a filmmakers, and also with the filmmakers that we usually produce, the first rough cut is super important, and because it's super fragile moment in the film, because it's the first time that you share with someone your film. So in that time we need like a specific tool, for instance this one, to to clarify a little bit more what is working, what is not working, what is understandable, what is not. And we are trying to use these kind of methodologies using computer vision and artificial intelligence to create that kind of stuff. For instance,
I was want to mention that there are some research that are just in really research beta, alpha test in Adobe, for example, or Runway, for example, that are trying to implement this changing, like, okay, what happens if we do not edit in a timeline and we edit in this latent space that is created with AI, no? Like we edit with this idea of clustering images and islands of knowledge, and we do not need to go linearly, if not like exploring a space. So we keep implementing this, then we can understand how many times a thing, a person, a subject appears in the film, so we can count things in our film that, of course, it's good for editing, and it's really good for searching anything in an archive. I mean, all these ideas has many applications that you can.
With this project in particular, we are using like open source models. So we are able to release like a free open source thing because we have the feeling that in artificial intelligence you are all the time with the new, all the time with the Gemini is the new thing, and in a week the Sora is the new thing, and so on. But to be honest, most of the time, most of the methods and the models that we have been using for so long, they are still like a super useful. Mm-hmm. For instance, this one is called YOLO, and YOLO is like a perhaps 2-3 years ago model, and it's super nice to recognize like objects, people, and so on. So it's useful in terms of editing because you don't need nothing else to create that kind of like a categorization of things, and then organize a little bit your movie in the way that that is the best for you.
Yeah, and now I don't know if some of you have used it, but for example, in Adobe Premiere, that is the one that we use, they are implementing those systems also, so you can do text edit. I don't know if some of you tried already. And so it really is starting to shape and changing the way we work, because if I can find anything through text, maybe I don't need to organize everything in folders before, right? So that things are really interesting.
Yeah, that thing is really useful for us as well, because when we are thinking about this technology as well, we are noticing that also new kind of methodologies start to emerge in a way, because that thing to perhaps allow this kind of methodology from text to edit rather to text to timeline and edit and that kind of stuff. So start like a new kind of digital methodologies that is really, really interesting. The last thing that perhaps we want to mention here, we are also developing as a research question as well. For instance, one of the things that is really common in filmmaking is try to detect shots, and that's very easy because every time that you press the button in the camera, it's like a shot, something like that. Something that really changed in your movie, right? But what happened with sequences? Because sequences is like a complex concept. What happened with a group of shots that that are part of a sequence? That's super complex because indeed in that kind of sequences you are talking about like locations, but also feelings, but also characters, and also narrative things. So we are start to developing like this kind of tool that is able to detect sequences as well, not only shots but sequences as well. Try to create a comparison between all of them, because with the new LLMs and BLMs and so on, they are super powerful in terms of description and have this kind of look like a really strong understanding of the content in a way that you could describe very well all the content that you have produced and then create that kind of comparison between all of them. So we are trying to get profit about this and really trying to create a machine that is able to to map all the material that we have.
Okay, so this is we wanted to show 5 minutes, but maybe we won't have time, so we will explain. And this is a documentary film. It's called Artifacts of War that we are producing. Jorge is directing. It's about the non-lethal weapons and the use of these so-called non-lethal or less lethal, but actually lethal weapons that use the police in rioting. Okay, you can see it. So this project. It's in pre-production now. We've been researching, we've been filming in these armed fairs, and we have a lot of archive, like this one, from protesters that, as you can see, it clearly is a...
Non-lethal weapons or riots?
No, un testimonio.
testimonies?
No, well, I mean, it's evidence about these violations of in the use of these non-lethal weapons, mostly by the police force. So we have a huge amount of this archive material. We are still researching, but we have a lot because we are doing collaborations with many activists and social media, etc., etc. So we are collaborating with one researcher from forensic architecture, is this collective from Goldsmith University, and we are in this super early development phase, and just we are trying to understand if we can transfer all these protocols to an algorithm so it really can detect it, because it's a matter of distance and inclination and understanding more the context and the background of the weapon and the kind of weapon. So machines are really good at that, on detecting things. So we are training some algorithms with the weapons. We are doing it now more in Spain because every country is different. Mm-hmm. But we really think that this is a really nice use of how technology can help us also to be aware of the police.
Yeah, and as we mentioned previously, I mean, we have the feeling that we are working both sides. The first one is like trying to using this kind of technology to map specific actions, a specific misuse of this kind of stuff, but also is working as aesthetics methodology for the film itself, because we are using that kind of techniques and methodologies to develop, to create like a meta-narrative to explain what was the process into the film. Actually, now we're working with another forensic architecture research for something similar in the Valle de los Caídos, that was like a valley of the Franco's civil war. And that kind of research using that kind of methodologies of technical digital methodologies to create like a speculative way of thinking about the possibilities of things using this kind of digital methods. Okay, so that's the thing related with content understanding. Perhaps it's half of the things that we have been done with Artefacto were related with that kind of stuff. And perhaps the second one is the most fancy, that is the content synthesis, right? The generative artificial intelligence that perhaps you already know for so long, and is these kind of possibilities of creating more content, more multimedia content.
So we are using it in several ways, in image synthesis, so really generating images, sounds, with restoration. Also we are using it a lot for accessibility, to be able to do more translations or more audio translation in several languages. This is really, really useful for that. And again, one of the things when we normally start using generative AI, we really try to understand why we are using it. And there is again these two ways, like it's efficiency or creative exploration. Normally we try to use for a creative exploration, and we think efficiency, of course, it's indeed in some of the processes, but really for us it's always trying to keep questioning you why you are using it, and not losing sight of the importance of using this technology, because as you know, it's impactful in the planet, in the ecology. So this for us, it's really challenging when we start to generate images with this.
In that sense, we have been working with several, models and so on. This is a project that we made with Groundwave 1 year ago, and we produced with them 5 different short films that were premiere in several film festivals. And actually here the challenge, it was it is possible to create like a kind of new aesthetics using this kind of technology. We produced this with the first generation of video models. So, the quality was quite different. It was like a more, different from realistic approach that all these models have now. We really create 5 different films that were really, really interesting in that stuff. 2 things are happening when you are trying to intertwine artificial intelligence and cinema. And the first thing for us is like the logics of traditional filmmaking perhaps is changing. Why? Because, you know, when you are talking about digital things in general, for instance, when you are creating like a website or an application and so on, that process are more iterative in a way, because you need to design and then test and then prototype, or prototype and then test, and then, you know, create all the things all the time, like these kind of iterative ways. In cinema, it's not working in that way. Perhaps in cinema, you are working more like in a very linear way, something like that. But now we are facing that kind of stuff that perhaps is quite challenging and interesting in a way, and we are facing this kind of stuff right now.
Yeah, mostly we realized when we started generating some projects that we will show some teasers now, so you can see that why we are keep doing the same methodology if we are using really another technology. So we started to work differently, and now we really don't close the script as we were closing it before, and we are trying to iterate from the very beginning. So we create the images, and then this image normally leads us to rewrite the script, but in a really more fast and iterative way, and then we generate the images, and then we start editing. So the process really, the boundaries of the pre-production, production, development start to blur and start to be really more engagement process. It's really interesting. So for us, that's one of the things that we like. Like, okay, if we use this, why are we using it all the time? It's a question that we have all the time, and how it's affecting us. So, and since we did it in this project, that it was one of the first ones that we were doing a 10-minute short film entirely generated. That now it was in the Lumen Prize as a finalist, and we realized that I mean we could change the paradigm, and now it's what we are doing. We start with the images, and we try to understand where technology can bring us forward in a way.
This is like a kind of first approach of one of the methodologies that we have been using when we are working with artificial intelligence in cinema. So as you could see, we divide our process like in 14 phases, different stages. And we have noticed that one of the things that is more, you know, like a particular in a way that perhaps when you are working with filmmaking, perhaps the production stage is perhaps the longer, the complex one. You know, perhaps in documentary, the post-production is also super complex as well. But, you know, in general terms, you could divide that kind of development, production and post-production and so on. But when you are using artificial intelligence, we have noticed that perhaps the production is shorter, but the post-production and the development is longer and complex. Why? Because you need to test a lot, and then you have the feeling that it's like you have been working with like 100 cameras. And it's super complex in terms of, you know, create like a kind of same aesthetics for all that kind of stuff. So perhaps, and that's a thing when you are, now we are working with several public broadcasters in Spain and try to explain that perhaps it's not that cheap a production with artificial intelligence, because you need to spend like a much more in colorist and in post-production and so on. Is perhaps not of the most obvious thing. And the other thing is trying to change the paradigm of perhaps you don't need to start with the script that is completely closed. Perhaps the first thing is to start with aesthetics and images and so on, and then trigger like a new kind of a script and that kind of iteration. So we, you know, like we have this kind of first methodology that is not the only one.
Since for us that project was with the one that we realized this changing of methodology, we are gonna put the teaser, that it's like 1 minute.
Durante décadas, nosotras, tataranietas de marionetas, autómatas, nietas de tantísimas abuelas, durante décadas pacientes, hemos registrado vuestras vidas. Todas. Bienvenidos al Museo del Siglo XXI. Este museo guarda toda la verdad que los espectadores heredarán. La nuestra. Esta sala que ves ahora está dedicada a Carla Espinosa. la joven empresaria que revolucionó el Ecuador del siglo XXI, del activista, que nos defendió a muerte y que después a muerte nos atacó. No intentéis de nuevo destruirnos sin contemplar la narrativa que tejemos. Nunca única.
So thank you. So this project it's a really beautiful project. Just two things. We were finalists, we didn't won, but it's okay, we were there. This project came because Jorge Carrion, he's a scriptwriter in Spanish, well-known scriptwriter. He came to us and said, I want you to adapt my novel, that it's a 21st century museum created by AI, and it's a really philosophical novel about how what it means to be human in the 21st century. So it has all the sense to make it to create with generative AI. So that was the first approach to this project. And when he came, he was like, okay, I want this to be like super commercial, okay? I don't want to be this essay philosophical thing, and we tried to do that, and that was the crack in this project. We realized that we were trying to mimicking the same thing that we do better with filming, right? Because since we were really aware of the flaws of the technology back then, it started 1 year ago. We knew that, of course, acting it's not the best, like the corporal movement. So we were doing a planification that it was really short, like really a planification that it was not allowing us to explore all the possibilities of the technology, and it was really based on faces and people talking heads. And then, of course, when we just did the first approach, we realized that it was not working, and we had the energy to redo it again. So it allowed us to, in a way, prototype a film. It's a thing that we didn't do before. Like, okay, let's test if this idea works, and you just kind of fast prototype your film, right? Understanding that it's not final. It's like, okay, no, this is not really working. And then we redo it. So it's a nice practice since then.
Okay, let me show you like another approach that perhaps we don't have much more time.
Soy Javier Soto, soy ayudante de dirección, llevo 35 años trabajando en cine. Como ayudante de dirección he trabajado con gente como Iñárritu, Bayona, Jonathan Glazer, Oliver Stone, Terry Gilliam, Alfonso Cuarón. Con el primer tumor vi al lobo, vi las orejas del lobo, vi el lobo entero, pero lo que no vi es la manada que hay detrás. Pasado mañana a las 7 de la mañana me van a quitar toda la laringe porque parece un segundo tumor. A partir del miércoles ya no voy a tener mi voz. El amor es lo que todo puede, o sea, sabes que después de lo que vaya a pasar va a haber gente que te va a agarrar, te va a coger y te va a sostener. Especialmente a la noche pensé, tengo que clonarme la voz. Yo estoy convencido que esto me va a servir para cuando esté jodido de verdad porque no tenga más voz, pues volver a escucharlo. Súper terapéutico. Hola a todos, muchísimas gracias por toda vuestra ayuda. Es que es igual.
So with this project, you know the story of La Sirenita, Little Mermaid, that kind of possibilities that you have that to keep your voice side. And I mean, we really want to show you this project because it's like a kind of new possibilities also in terms of, like a production scheme and other kind of aesthetics as well. We're working with Jonathan Rotherson, perhaps you already know him. Is this guy that is, he has this kind of incredible book that is called The Soft Atlas of Amsterdam. And he's, working in these kind of techniques that everything is placed in one single image, and all the things that are like a sounds, they are like a text in the images. So we are working with him, and he's creating the images and the illustrations of the history of Javier. And then we are using artificial intelligence to move and create the animation of that kind of stuff, So, we notice also that perhaps another possibility that allows these kind of technologies, let's keep everything in the artist level, that is Javier as the illustrator and so on, and perhaps the animation and perhaps some layers of animation. We are using that kind of techniques specifically to use it. So it's like not everything is like let's try to create the image and the animations and everything with one model, but perhaps like a kind of different layers of using artificial intelligence, and in this sense, this project allows us.
And also there was a beautiful thing in this project that when Javier came to us, I mean, we're friends, but he was like, okay, I want to clone my voice because I'm going to lose it because I have this larynx operation. And we did that with some friends. We recorded like 3 hours of his voice in different registers, like conversational, reading, etc., etc. Then we create this the system that it was through Telegram. So he could write the text, and then the Telegram was reproducing his voice. And that thing, it was super important for him in the recovery after the operation, because in a way it was like, it has encapsulated his soul in a way. Now he starts to speak again. In fact, he will come here in 2 days. So this is another way that you can use AI in several parts of the projects.
And also something that is interesting as well is that, when you are talking about artificial intelligence, perhaps everything is related, and the limits of artificial intelligence as well. Because, most of the time things, or perhaps seems that artificial intelligence allows us like everything, and we are like completely sure that we are not yet, and we are not completely sure that we will be there in that place of replacement, because, the complex of humanity is super physical as well, and if you are trying to create something meaningful, is not something that you could synthesize everything with a text or something like that. But in a way, you are start dealing with that kind of stuff that is like using iconotextual language that is using text and images and sounds and videos and so on. Perhaps it's complex, but it's not enough to create the complexity of the cinema language in a way. But still, with this project, we are dealing with this kind of stuff, or let's try to create like a new aesthetics with this image and so on, not only with text, but this kind of iconotextual possibilities as well.
And last but not least, we are gonna talk about the project that we have here. Vemos el teaser. Okay.
Fueron antes y un después en la historia de nuestra nación. Las medidas tomadas por el gobierno se justificaban plenamente.
It's not a spoiler, but well, a little bit. So yeah, if you all wanna watch the film, anyway, the film it's a reflection on with false memories or false archive, and what happened when you create archive with AI, which is a big subject, because in a way you lose trace of any event, right? Now that we can create images that are really, that it looks like real. No, where is truth? If truth is a thing that we can talk about, where is fact? What happened with the relationship with the document in itself? No, and it's no longer an indexation of a fact that really occurred. If not, it's more an invention. In fact, tomorrow in the workshop we will discuss really with some practices about this. Because now we are in this era and we really need to talk about this. So mostly the film, it's a provocation to create discourse and debate about this.
No, actually, yes. In the workshop that we will start tomorrow, we will start dealing with this kind of stuff because now. Perhaps we have the feeling that when we are talking about artificial intelligence, seems that we are like premiering for the first time the use or the bad uses of the fake of images and videos and so on, and that's not new at all. Perhaps the thing with artificial intelligence is related with the scale, with how many people are able to use that kind of techniques to create that kind of fiction or create that kind of manipulation of archives or facts or whatever. But it's not new at all. So we really are looking or dealing with that kind of stuff in terms of the scale rather than in terms of originality or the first time that has happened right now. No? So yeah, we are dealing with, yeah.
No, just to finish with these reflections that when we approach this technology from the documentary perspective, it really seems that we are discovering things for the first time. But manipulation, of course, it's not a thing that started with AI. No. So this image, probably you all know, of course, Nanook of the North, it was all created, right? And it's this pact that we establish, and many things, for example, when the birth of photojournalism and during the Civil War in America, Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady, I don't know if you know the story, it's really interesting. They were also fabricating the images of the Civil War. They were moving the same corpse and they were using it and staging it for the pictures, and they were not really in the front and so on. Like in National Geographic in 1982, they moved the pyramids so they fit in the cover. And so on. There are many cases like this. So now the important thing is not that we can do this with AI. It's okay, now we can do it at a scale that we couldn't do it before, and it's really more accessible. You really do not need a lot of skills now to do this. And of course, it's really easy to float the internet and social media. Of course, now we are talking about cinema, and in this in this area, we establish a pact with the viewer, and we know that we are in a scenario. You have some time, you watch it, you have to label it, you can say it's AI or not at the beginning, at the end, but you are in an environment, controlled environment. Social media is another thing, we are not going to talk about this, but the scale, it's the thing that I think we should establish a new paradigm. Yeah.
So, now we are facing this kind, like with the emergence of this kind of technology, perhaps we are talking about like 4 or 5 years ago, there was like a first stage of, okay, this is the beginning of something, okay? And it was like a kind of a wow effect. And now we are, like trespass this kind of wow effect. And the thing is, okay, is this meaningful in a way to create something that is relevant for the filmmaking? And how and why we are dealing with these kind of movies and these kind of images and so on. So we are, addressing several challenges in several ways. Perhaps the first is related with technical challenges. From the very beginning, we were dealing with, okay, it's possible to create something that is that has the continuity for the filmmaking, for instance, in character, in scenarios, and so on. And this is something that perhaps we have arrived to something really continuous in that way, or the anthropomorphic accuracy. And perhaps these two things are really, we are there now. But the other things are super complex. Perhaps we have the feeling that we are not able to go there because, as I said, the complex of reality is not related with the prompt. But one of the things that we have noticed is the prompt adherence is not really in the mood of creating like a really nice or really like a meaningful filmmaking, because not everything is related with text. But we are facing like several challenges here as well. For instance, in Spain, we have this, we are dealing with minority languages all the time, in Catalan, in Basque language, and so on. So, as you could imagine, create something that is, interesting for Basque language or Catalan language is super complex in artificial intelligence, and so on. I mean, we are talking about like a very limitation in terms of lengths, or you don't have that kind of control of details, micro expression of characters, and so on. And this is something that is, like a very, very strong limitation of this kind of technologies.
Okay, and just the last one to finish, because we are just finishing. Okay. I just would like to finish with this quote, because today we were trying to explain you like, hey, we are using this maybe in a different way, and not following the narrative like that Nadia was mentioning before, like more, better, faster, and whatever. And so we were trying to open this good path that, okay, we can use it for these really nice things. We can talk about all the bad things also when you want. But also, I think it's important to understand that now we are in a really important moment where we can still shape this technology, and that it's really, really important, because if you read this book, it's really important to understand that never all the prosperity and social prosperity came embedded in the technology. It was all the social struggles that happened while the technology was being implemented, like now that it's like really implemented with 4 companies, 5 white guys from Silicon Valley. So anyway, we have a lot to say, and I think it's important that we shape the technology for our own good and how we want. That's it. Thank you.
Well, we have time for questions, and we can do 2 things. Pablo will walk around, and you can just shout, like, just put your hand up, or just say, hello, and Pablo will bring you the mic, ask you a question. If you are a little shy, or your question is a little controversial. Actually, that's actually we welcome that. You just speak. But if you are a little shy, you can also put your question up through the keyboard.
We're recording this lecture, so we appreciate that you wait until I hand you the microphone. In that way, we can also have the question formulated in the video for our record. But before having the microphone, I have a question. Do you? Yeah, maybe it's better that you sit here. Sit here. And it was about the script writing research that you've been doing. I've seen a lot of software and that works around script writing, and also I understand that script writing is a very formulaic way of working, because you have different formulas, but there's always connected to time and structures. The part that I find challenging is when you move from structure to scenes and dialogue. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you have found an approach, or if you have reflected about how AI could be used for either informing or inspiring or helping scriptwriters to write the lines of characters, which always have a lot of not very explicit. They're not really saying what they mean, and that's part of the richness of scene writing.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, in the tool that we have developed, rather than to create like a kind of suggestions of lines of the dialogues and so on, we have created like several visualizations about the different relationships between characters. And you, as a script writer, has like a new kind of map of possibilities of, okay, this character is saying this to the other one in this sequence and saying that in the other one, and you have like a kind of map of that, and perhaps you are able to create like something meaningful beyond of that, from that, rather than to say, okay, what is the best line for this character and so on, because the tool is really in the way of visualization, data visualization, and connection between everything. That is not like that easier, rather than to give suggestions of specific things.
Questions? I'll take that one.
Someone just posted a comment. You can also do that, or just send them a little love note.
Super.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I think I understand the potentials of the AI in the research you're doing, but it wasn't quite clear to me, or maybe I missed what insights you actually gained, for example, from the research into the social media imagery, or the other with the non-lethal weapons. Like I get what was being looked at, but what was actually taken out of it?
Okay.
Where did it become tangible? Yeah.
So with the film, for the non-lethal, it's under development yet, so we didn't get there. But the idea is it will be part of the film, and then it will be a tool that it will be out there, like open source. And the idea is that you can upload a video and understand if it was a violation of the rules of the regulation of how it has to be used, this non-lethal weapon, because most of the times when there is a an injury or a murder, it's because of the misuse, meaning like it has to be shot like minimum 40 meters, and normally it's like 5 meters. You can never point at the head. It's always pointing at the head. So it's really, are the parameters that we are feeding into the algorithm, so we can have a super detector of how the police is misusing this. But we are still developing this. And the other thing, the other is because we wanted some tools to analyze what's happening in social media with AI. What kind of videos, which type, which genres, if we can understand and classify this ecosystem, just to understand how people is using it. It was this only for us to understand, because there was at some point after BO3 and Sora 2, these new models that they have audio in sync, that the social media was even more fluid, with all this kind of videos. So we were really keen to understand, okay, which types are there. So it was purely to understand the ecosystem also.
Shall we take one of the questions there?
Yeah.
Maybe you can choose, Nadia.
Take one. I don't have a mic.
Sorry.
And no straps. Okay, cool. Also wanted to add, there's another project that I think is similar that I really like, as like a counter surveillance. It's called like the Flemish Brothers. It's quite an old,
exactly.
quite an old project, but
Gris reported.
Gris made like a very simple program that watches like I think like the Belgian council. Like the parliament have meetings, and then like use object detection to see who's like on their phones during like the meetings, and then have like a sort of live Twitter thing tagging them, being like, hey, you've been on your phone for 2 minutes, like maybe pay attention to these like bills being passed or not. And so I think that's like it's like a counter surveillance, a sort of like activism use of a technology that's often sort of used the other way around. That made me think of that.
Sorry, what is the name of that?
Flemish scrollers, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gris the porter. Yeah.
He's really amazing.
Super
Great guy. Great guy. He's really sweet. Okay, so there's some nice questions here. Woohoo. Maybe like let's give the people a practical takeaway as well. You mark the continuity problem between like shots as a solved problem, or like you ticked it off on your list of technical challenges. How do you achieve that? Yes, you are.
The shots.
Like
Continuity of like character.
La continuidad del estilo, de los characters. Okay, so mostly how we do it is normally we work. Bueno, I don't know who did the question. Normally we work text to image. Okay, we create some image reference, and then image to video. This is normally the workflow that when we do it this way, we can handle more continuity in all the aspects, right? In not only in the characters but also the aesthetics. You know that one frame is similar to the other in the sense. So when we do it with these images, it works pretty well. Now the last models really they have more embedded things. We always use the same description of lighting and the same exact description with the image reference, and then when we start creating this imaginary world or whatever, like Membrana that you have seen, or 9 de Mayo, and then we start feeding also as a reference our own images from the result. So the output became input reference as well. So then we handle pretty well. But 1 year ago we were struggling a lot with this. Yeah, I mean it was interesting also because this trial and error, it's always fun, and you get some things there. One of the things that we really take out of this technology is like, okay, if you have this time, to learn and to do mistakes, it's more interesting.
No, I mean we also have like a long prompts or something like that. I mean, if you are interested, we have like a open source all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So we have a GitHub with all, especially with video and Google things and so on. We have like a list of open source things that if you want to have it, just let us know and we will send it to you.
Yeah, where can we find that?
Yes, in Artefacto, I mean the prompt guide of video and nano and so on. I have it. I have the link, but I don't know. Give me a second.
Is it on your Git?
No. Sorry, I have it here.
We are updating our site, but hopefully in 1 month we will have all the resources there, like in a more regular basis, updated. So it's artefactofilms.com. But anyway, now Jorge will say it.
Shall we ask her a new question?
Quick fun fact.
Maybe.
Doing text to image and then image to video is also much less bad for the planet than doing like text to video. So it's more creative control and less destruction.
Yeah.
So would recommend.
Yeah, and one thing, that's super important because for me it's one of you always have contradictions, right, in life, but this is the biggest one I have when I'm using this technology. And now we are implementing a methodology, like we are restricting the creations. Like, okay, we create like 5 images. Yeah, max. Yeah, it's like, no, we create 5. I mean, it should be enough. Because how many retakes you have in real life when you are shooting. So also we are putting every time more kind of constraints when we create with those tools, because I think it allows the creativity to be more, more flourished, and also for this reason.
And don't say thank you to ChatGPT because that also creates unnecessary energy use.
Hi, yeah. You just mentioned that you put constraints on the output because maybe you have like unlimited outputs, and then it maybe becomes harder to choose.
exactly it. So.
And so I was also wondering about the iterative approach that you mentioned before. I think it's very interesting because you can make a lot of things very fast and maybe get a lot of feedback. How do you envision this in the future? Because I see it as a very viable alternative to like the very complex process of a lot of upfront investment. A lot of the industry right now is like very organized to promote like some sort of predictive, to predict the success of the outcome. So how do you maybe envision this iterative design process for film specifically, and what developments need to happen maybe in the future to make this really workable?
Yeah. So that's super interesting. Sorry, the first thing is that, I mean, if you want to work with Google in general, we have created like a very complete prompt guide and API guide and so on. In that link, you are open to use it. And regarding your question, yeah, super interesting in a way because we usually work with people that are coming from cinema in general, so most of the time is like artists that have been working with cinema for so long, and when they arrive with us with using artificial intelligence, they already have like a lot of knowledge about creating that kind of stuff. So it's not like their knowledge is related with the previous experience that they already have. So it's not related with, okay, let's decide in the void, because they already know like a lot of, like experience in that kind of stuff. So we have the feeling that, there's a need to create like a kind of new skills to use that kind of technology that is something in the middle between coders and very experienced DOPs, art directors, and so on. And it's very neat to have these kind of skills before, to using that kind of technology. With the people that we usually work, they have like a lot of experience without artificial intelligence to decide which one is the best. So I have the feeling that we still need that kind of knowledge previously. That is not that easy to say, okay, I have like 1 million images, let's decide which one is the best. If you haven't created something with an analogical way, you are not able to decide which one is the best, And most of the time, with the very relevant things that we have been doing, we notice that the filmmakers that have been doing this with 16 millimeters and so on, they are super in the mood of creating super relevant because they already have all this information. So, for us at least, it's like a kind of, mixing of knowledge that they already have with these kind of new possibilities. Right?
And also I was thinking regarding this idea of iteration, at least I envision like maybe different future scenarios, right? For example, one thing that follows our practice. Now we discover that we can prototype films, which is a thing that we did it like by accident, right? Because we didn't like that and we create another one. So it's like, okay, I can do this, that's interesting. What it's useful this? I can show my film to someone previously so I can communicate better what I want instead of only relying on written material, because we're filmmakers, right? Maybe we can communicate better through, a teaser. We always need a teaser. Right now we can create better teasers maybe, and this kind of prototype. So maybe it allows to get finance easily because we can express better or not getting the finance, but maybe it's a more natural process for us as a filmmakers than just write everything sometimes, no? Also I envision another thing that, okay, maybe these films just stay there as a prototype and create, okay, because sometimes you cannot finance your film, like, okay, so I will do it with AI, maybe it's a way to do a film with less budget, of course, no? That's another thing. And another scenario, because we are talking from our side that it's more independent filmmaking, right? Another side is the industry, the big industry. We are in the industry, but not in Hollywood, right? So yeah, prediction and standardization, seeing the same again over and over, it's already happening, right? So now again the scale, so it will happen more. The personalization, it's a thing that it's really in the industry for the advertisement, for for the engagement of the people. So yeah, this path I see it more in this way, no, that it can lead towards more of the same and more faster and more kind of niche isolation and not sharing things, right?
And we also let me show you because one of the things that we have noticed also is we have created this application. Everything is we have created this application, and most of the times when we are because this is like a kind of directory of social media and media in social media made with artificial intelligence. So we have like a channel and we thousands of videos, and then we scrap that and create that kind of archive of this kind of stuff to decide to select what was meaningful for us. And most of the time you notice that there's plenty of this.
¿Sabes dónde queda la calle Campana? No, pero me suena.
That kind of stuff that is super repetitive, right? These kind of memes or these kind of stuff. I don't remember that kind of things with Bob Ross and stuff. There's plenty of this, But to figure out which one is meaningful is super complex. Perhaps it's harder than before. But we are trying to identify which one of all of those are really meaningful and is super hard. But at the end, we finally get 2 or 3 artists that are using artificial intelligence in a very incredible way in terms of aesthetics, in terms to get profit of the mistakes of artificial intelligence as well. So in a way, there's a kind of homogenization, obviously. Yeah. But something that is really meaningful is still there, and you need to, to hurgar, to go further, to go deep, to find the good one. Yeah.
We had another question there in the back.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated many things, but your approach to when you talked about the difference between using an LLM and the way that you're using, for example, with the scripts, I think you're really talking about, using technology that helps you to think more and be more creative rather than offloading the work onto it. And I'm trying to kind of also thinking about your collaboration, your working together, and how often I find working with an LLM or people who are also working alone a lot, that becomes a communication, right, with the ChatGPT or other technology that kind of tries to replace or is another form of collaboration. That what I am also just appreciating your collaboration going on for a long time, that there's something about working really closely with another person, being in communication that kind of maybe prevents you from getting into this other collaboration with the the chat bot. So I just wondered if you can speak at all about your collaboration, maybe having to do with AI or not, but just how you've been working together and how long, how it works.
We as a person, we together. Okay. So yeah, we've been working for the last almost 8-9 years. Yeah. So it's good so far. We are here.
And well, actually, I mean, we are the leaders of the company, but we are not alone. I mean, we in the production company usually work with the prom guy that is a very well known, a very nice art director, and we also have some engineers and some filmmakers also, and we are a project-based company that is, like a looking for projects all the time, and we are creating that kind of, like a networks with several people in different countries, actually, to create that kind of new possibilities, because we really believe that perhaps this technology allows us to create like another kind of, like a visualizations and so on. So yes, it's like we are like not just the two of us creating all that kind of stuff, but we are like a team.
A question here.
So firstly, I think on the generative AI, I think it must be fascinating as a filmmaker to be able to use this type of technology.
Yeah.
And you were just mentioning about the industry as a whole, and I'm wondering, in a multi-million-dollar industry, billion-dollar industry, there are many other players outside of filmmakers, like actors or film set creators. I'm wondering what kind of disruption this will have for the industry as a whole, and whether or not you as a company have gotten backlash from the industry based on the fact that this might disrupt budgets to go to millions of people working here.
Yeah, it's a big issue. That's for example in Spain, and I'm talking about Spain now because the state is different, like every country is different. So I will talk about this our reality now. What's going on in Spain? It's really slow. So people, it's really adopting it in slow and really chaotic and not sharing way. Meaning. That's why we are doing a really important thing now in Spain, that it's like gathering all the important actors, like key people in the industry, like from cross-sectorial, from all, the departments everywhere, together in a meeting to discuss like how we want this to be implemented. Not from the laws, not from up down, bottom up, right? So, but there are some challenges there, because if you want to discuss how you want this technology to be implemented, you need to understand a little bit the technology, how it works, how it can happen. So now we are in this process of first, knowledge, sharing knowledge and kind of education of, the goods and the bads, the opportunities and this. So if we need to decide with some information, right? So it's not an easy thing to understand, but what we are trying to do is like, okay, if we are all in the same boat, then we can decide how to implement. So, and because of course, if we don't share how we are gonna use it, of course, the first thing that it will happen is like job losses. Why? Because budgets, it's difficult to get finance, so it's already happening, but there are things that we really maybe don't care a lot. For example, who were doing physical transcriptions of the interviews? Who was doing that? Me, like everyone. I was working. It was my first job. I was transcribing in the TV station, and now it's a job that no one is doing. We did automatization in this job, but maybe it was not so relevant that it was not important. Actors, of course, are important. Directors, of course, are important. No? So we really need to understand that sometimes we automatize things without asking each other, and that we need to create those spaces to set up some moral standards, other ways. Yeah, it will be difficult.
And also, yes, completely agree with you. And also because, in the big industries, we are also like, they're creating this kind of, perhaps you already know this, let me show you, I have the feeling that we have it here, or perhaps here. Like this, like a big, I don't know if you are familiar with these kind of tables. This appears like perhaps 3-4 weeks ago. So, it's not something that is happening in The Voice. Like most of the broadcasters like Netflix, Warner, and so on, they are like facing this kind of, like restrictions related with the unions of the actors and the scriptwriters and so on. So we are, there are like several regulations as well. And here in Europe, we have this kind of AI Act that the idea is to start to implement in 2027 about the uses of artificial intelligence and so on. So I have the feeling that related with what Anna has mentioned, there's like a lot of regulations, and for me at least, it's like a matter of regulation and how we are, we need as a citizens and as a filmmakers to obligate that kind of technologies to be more transparent with the data, more transparent with the things that they were doing, and also to promote that kind of public AI also as well. But at least in terms of the big industry and so on, there's like a lot of rules and regulations regarding with the uses of artificial intelligence.
Last thing, because if you see here in the third one, it says it requires escalation as it could impact legal rights, audience perception, or union roles. I think those are the three things that are really on stake in terms of industry, right? Because there is also the audience. We haven't talked about how the perception of the people, changes, or how it's impacting us on this also. So yeah, it's an ongoing conversation, and of course it's gonna be like super disruptive because it's happening already now. And also not in terms of jobs and these things, also in terms of distribution, for example, like how now the channels of distribution, like you create, you distribute at the same time, all this, changing of the landscape. We just need to talk about it, how we want to distribute.
Yeah, and as a filmmakers and independent filmmakers, we usually work with protocols, like a kind of transparency protocols and so on. Perhaps we don't have time to talk about that, but there's like a lot of like a kind of metadata that you can embed to that kind of media to keep the traceability of all that kind of stuff, to avoid any kind of, like a misunderstanding and faking and so on. So there's like possibilities to keep that in mind. Yeah.
We have time for a last short question. Is that a short question?
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
And after that, we can have drinks outside right here, so you can still ask your questions.
Yes, thank you so much also for the reflections that you were giving. And one example that I really liked is that you mentioned you allow yourself only to generate something, for example, 5 times as a restriction. Are there any other types of new tensions or responsibilities you feel that are emerging? So I'm not sure how short the question is. That you've already experienced, and at what moments do you experience those?
Well, we have everything is related with the things that I have there, but it's okay. No? So one of the things that we usually do is create a lot of tables to use that kind of technology. So I have a table that is like a kind of different models and what are the restrictions, because we usually read a lot. Well, yes, but it's like a kind of, the first thing is to understand which one is the best model for us for a specific project. And it's like a kind of a lot of restrictions between, legal uses, and if he's able to use that kind of technology, who is behind that kind of possibility. So, we are keeping the track all the time with the rules and regulations of the different models. So we have several tables all the time that, this is able to do that. For instance, if we are trying to work with some public broadcasters, we avoid a really nice models that we really like, because they are not able, or perhaps they will be bringing some kind of legal issues and so on. Perhaps, for instance, in Midjourney that perhaps is a really well-known model that perhaps you already know, but there's something in the legal terms that when you are using Midjourney, you are creating an image with them, and the rights of the image are shared between you and Midjourney. So Midjourney is able to use that image as well with you. And for instance, if you are working with a broadcaster, it's not that right to have this kind of like a sharing right for that kind of stuff. So that's one of the things that is perhaps more technical in a way. But the other thing is the number of times that we need to create, to press the button to create perhaps one image, and how could we reduce that kind of things. So we are creating several methodologies related with that, right?
Yeah, I think in the difference between when I started using that, and I'm talking about GPT era, right? Not before, because we were talking about guns, about another thing that it was more. At the beginning, I was kind of pressing the button, and now I think a lot before. I think more, because and for this sustainability thing and for my brain also, and it really changed the way I think, and I like that because I'm more inductive, I do, and then sometimes I understand, and now it makes me think, okay, before pressing the button to Cloud or Gemini, when I'm working with text, I organize super good all the information, so it allows me this structure, and that I like it a lot. And in terms of these contradictions, how we deal, for example, open source, it's I want to use open source models, but then you use open source models and then the results maybe are not so good. So, but we keep trying, we keep trying Comfy and another workflows to things, because I feel more aligned with that than, of course, Google. It's I'm using Google, I feel bad about it. So, or another things, for example, that's maybe a simple thing, but translations, I translate with those things, to English. Before, many years ago, we were using Google Translate, but also we were hiring people to translate. I'm not doing that anymore. So it's in these small decisions that really, I think we impact the industry, the things. So I try to keep track on those decisions and why I take those or not, it's a thing.
But you make me think about the open source community, because we usually work with, for instance, for the translation, we have a model that is working in a machine, in our own machine. So everything that is for translation, we only use that kind of stuff, that is working, and it's super good. You don't need to have the last one thing. And for instance, one of the tools that we have shown here, they, as I said, they use open source models, because you don't need to have all the time that kind of stuff. And also we get profit of a lot kind of structures. We create a lot of applications and a lot of APIs and a lot of a longer structures, JSON or kind of structures in the calls of the models to create ones, for the entire text, rather than to create a lot of and iterate that kind of stuff and so on. So that's the other thing that we keep in mind all the time, to summarize and how to create something that is repetitive and something that could be useful for more than one time. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're wrapping up. There were many more questions, and I'm sure you have many more insights. So we have a bit of time over drinks. I'd like to thank you for speaking and sharing all your thoughts and ideas and research and works in progress. And thank to all of you for joining. We'll be doing more of these. We're doing also a workshop tomorrow. Are some of you joining us? Good. Yeah, okay, if you're nice. Well, see you in the morning. Have a good night's rest. If you'd like to join future events, you can scan the QR and join a mailing list if you're an inbox type of person, or find us on the other things if you're a scrolly type of person. Hope to see you at one of these future things. Thank you. And have a beautiful evening.